Carbohydrates, the dietary love-hate relationship. One minute they're fueling an Olympic athlete to victory, and then the next they're being blamed for health problems such as weight gain, diabetes, and many other health conditions. So what's really going on with carbs? And how many do you really need? Could you completely live without them? What's the deal with fructose and high fructose corn syrup? Are there really good carbs and bad carbs? Or are they just all bad to the point where everybody just needs to consider getting on a ketogenic diet? Well, clearly there's a lot of confusion and differing views on carbs. So we've decided to do a two-part video series to tackle all of these questions and give you as much accurate information as possible so that you can make the best dietary decisions for your own personal situation. So today, we're going to cover the different types of carbohydrates, how your body actually breaks them down and absorbs them. We'll also discuss what fructose really is and what your body really does with it, talk about if carbs can really cause weight gain, and then get into the potential harmful effects of carbohydrates. All of this setting the stage for the next part of how many carbs you really need, could you completely live without them, and how different forms of exercise influence carbohydrate metabolism and even ketogenic diets. We've definitely got a lot of hot sugary information to cover, so let's get into this anatomical and physiological awesomeness. Carbohydrates are molecules made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they are obviously found in many different foods and exist in different forms. And understanding these different forms will be important to understanding how our bodies process and utilize carbs. There are monosaccharides, mono meaning one and saccharide referring to sugar. So this is one sugar molecule or one sugar unit. And the monosaccharides that are found in food include glucose, fructose, and galactose. There are also disaccharides, which are two sugar units, or in other words, two monosaccharides bonded together. And the disaccharides found in food include sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is a glucose and fructose bonded together. Lactose, the milk sugar, is glucose and galactose bonded together. And the lesser well-known maltose is two glucose molecules bonded together. And then there are the polysaccharides. Poly means many, and these are essentially chains of multiple glucose molecules bonded together. And in food, these are found as amylose and amylopectin, which are sometimes also just referred to as starches. But the polysaccharides also include fiber, which we lack the enzymes to break down. And our bodies also store another polysaccharide called glycogen, and it stores this glycogen in the liver and muscles. And we'll talk more about muscle glycogen storage in just a little bit. Now, this is sometimes where people can start labeling carbs as good or bad. Monosaccharides and disaccharides are also often referred to as simple sugars or simple carbs, and they can be digested and absorbed quickly. And because of this, they sometimes get labeled as bad because they can potentially cause spikes in blood sugar, or what I'll refer to as blood glucose levels from here on out. The polysaccharides are often referred to as complex carbohydrates, as they take longer to digest and absorb. And because of this slower, more sustained release, they have a tendency not to spike blood glucose levels as much as the simple carbs, and therefore sometimes get referred to as good carbs. But we're going to find that these good and bad labels are a bit short-sighted. And one thing that's going to help us understand why that is by going over the fate of all carbohydrates. You see, no matter what type of carbohydrate you eat, whether it's a polysaccharide from a vegetable or a whole grain, or a disaccharide from a fruit or table sugar, all of these carbohydrates will eventually end up becoming the exact same thing. Since we're talking about how our bodies process and utilize carbohydrates, let's shift to something we all consume daily and tends to follow carbohydrates into the muscles, and that is water. And so I'm excited to partner with Cove Pure, a brand that believes that drinking clean water should be a given, not a luxury. And here are some reasons why this matters. 70 million Americans have PFAs, forever chemicals, in their tap water. And studies link PFAs to irregular menstrual cycles, early menopause, and even weight gain. Plus, tap water can carry arsenic, nitrates, and microplastics, all tied to certain health risks. Now, admittedly, I have been skeptical about contaminated water claims, so I checked my own water by using the EWG tap water database for my zip code, and I was a bit surprised. 14 contaminants above health guidelines, including PFAs, nitrate, and all other sorts of interesting contaminants. And some of these levels are technically legal. And I'm guessing most of us would agree that we would like the purest water available, and Cove Pure's got the fix. Their clear wave filtration eliminates up to 99.9% of impurities, as it can eliminate impurities that are as small as 0.0001 microns. For reference, a speck of dust is 250,000 times bigger. And some of the features that I love is that it's a countertop unit, so no plumber needed, and it's perfect for pretty much any kitchen setup. And the real-time TDS display shows my water's purity, so you know you're getting the purest and freshest water with every little sip. So if you want the healthiest water for you and your family, scan the QR code or go to covepure.com/humananatomy to get $200 off your Cove Pure machine. That information will also be in the description below. And now, let's get back to those carbohydrates. And so let me explain what I mean by all carbohydrates eventually becoming the exact same thing. Your body can only absorb monosaccharides. So that would be the individual sugar molecules, glucose, fructose, and galactose. So if you ingested monosaccharides, your body wouldn't really have to do any digesting, and those monosaccharides would eventually be absorbed through the small intestine. However, most of the carbohydrates that we eat come in the form of disaccharides and polysaccharides. And so our body is going to need to break those down into the individual monosaccharides before any absorption can take place. So let's say we eat a carbohydrate-rich meal. We're going to take in some table sugar, so we have some sucrose. Let's also add a complex carbohydrate like amylose from, say, like a potato, and then also throw in some yogurt so we can have some lactose. I know that's a little bit of a weird meal, and now that I think about it, we probably could have used some sour cream instead of the yogurt to get that lactose, but we're in too deep now, and I just wanted to have enough of the different types of carbohydrates so that we can illustrate the point of how all carbohydrates eventually end up as the same thing. So now we put all of those carbs into the mouth, also known as the oral cavity, and this is where digestion begins, mechanically from chewing, as well as chemically from some of the enzymes that are found in the saliva. And just because this is really cool, if I turn this sagittal head dissection over, you can see the largest salivary gland, the parotid gland, and even another salivary gland called the submandibular gland. But then we're going to swallow those carbs, and they'll pass down through the esophagus and enter into the stomach. The stomach will act as a muscular blender, mixing everything together. But specifically for carbs, the next major part of digestion occurs in the following portion of the digestive tract called the small intestine. The small intestine contains specific enzymes that break down specific carbohydrates. For example, there's an enzyme called Sucrase, which will break down the sucrose into the individual glucose and fructose molecules. We also have lactase, which is the enzyme that can break down lactose into the individual glucose and galactose molecules. And as an FYI, someone who doesn't make as much lactase, that person would have limitations on how much lactose they could digest, and therefore could develop lactose intolerance. And so then much of that lactose won't get broken down and therefore won't get absorbed. So then it just moves down into the large intestine and can eventually cause bloating, abdominal pain, and potentially really stinky gas and diarrhea. If you picked up on a little bit of an emotional response from me there, that's because one of my best friends from my childhood was lactose intolerant, but he continued to eat it anyway. And there were some car rides that I wish I could have severed my olfactory nerve, aka cranial nerve 1. But coming back to the amylose now, that complex carbohydrate or polysaccharide. Remember, these were long chains of glucose molecules bonded together, and we have specific enzymes that will break off those individual glucose molecules. And because these polysaccharides are so much larger than the disaccharides, it takes more time to break off those individual glucose molecules. And so you can see why these polysaccharides, or complex carbohydrates, would be more of a slow, sustained release and would not spike blood glucose levels as much as those disaccharides like sucrose and lactose. But you can see from the weird meal that we've just eaten, after digestion, we are now only left with the monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, hanging out within the small intestine. But now we can absorb them. There are some differences in how they can be absorbed, but eventually each one of those monosaccharides will get absorbed through the intestinal cells and then absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, the vast majority of those monosaccharides are going to be glucose, because glucose made up 100% of the amylose and then contributed to half of the lactose and half of the sucrose. But what's really interesting and cool is that if I lift up the small intestine on this particular cadaver dissection, you can see this yellowy tissue called mesentery. the mesentery connects all 20 feet of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So those horror movies often take some extra liberties when they show the small intestine just completely flopping out of the body with one cut from that evil villain. Like, I had to spend quite a bit of time removing this small intestine from the other body. It wasn't just one magical ninja cut. And so here we expose one of the many anatomical inaccuracies of Hollywood. And for any producers and directors that are watching this, I'm available for consultation. But another cool function of the mesentery is if you look closely, you can see the mesentery also contains this incredible network of blood vessels. And this network of blood vessels is where the carbohydrates are getting absorbed. And all of these blood vessels from the digestive tract that are bringing in the monosaccharides, all of them will funnel into a large vein called the hepatic portal vein. Hepatic just means pertaining to the liver. So all of these monosaccharides will first go into the liver before entering systemic circulation, or in other words, before they can circulate through the entire body. And here's an extremely important point. The liver is incredibly good at capturing all of the fructose and galactose. And before the liver lets any of that fructose and galactose leave to circulate throughout the body, it converts both of them into glucose. And so this finally gives us the answer of what I meant by all carbohydrates ending up as the same thing. No matter what form of carbohydrate you eat, if that carbohydrate includes glucose, then it doesn't have to do any conversion in the liver. But if it has any fructose or galactose in the carbohydrate that you just ingested, it will get converted into glucose before it can circulate throughout the body. So the end game is always glucose. We don't ever measure blood fructose levels or blood galactose levels, we measure blood glucose levels. And so what does all this mean when it comes to all of those simple sugars out there? Like, for example, is high fructose corn syrup really that bad for you? And if it is, what makes it bad for you? Is it because it has more fructose in it? Because that fructose, as we now know, just gets converted to glucose anyway. Another thing to consider with the end game always being glucose is that oftentimes people will say that table sugar, which is sucrose, is bad for you. Some even go as far as to say it's almost poisonous. But your body has no way of distinguishing between a glucose molecule that came from table sugar versus a glucose molecule that came from some vegetable that may be considered a superfood. The glucose molecules have the exact same structure and characteristics. And so it's not like the glucose molecule that came from the sucrose would be any more poisonous compared to the glucose molecule that came from that superfood. Now, before those that hate sugar destroy me in the comments, I am not saying that there are not any negatives to table sugar or high fructose corn syrup. There are plenty of drawbacks, and it actually is a great idea to limit your intake of them. I just think it is short-sighted to say that these disaccharides or simple sugars are completely bad and directly hurt your body, because that's not true. It's more nuanced than that. Yes, it is true that table sugar and other simple sugars have a tendency to spike your blood glucose levels, especially if ingested by themselves. And in general, it is better to have most of your carbohydrate intake from whole food sources and complex carbohydrates that result in a slower, steady, and sustained release of glucose into the bloodstream. But again, there are situations in sports and athletics and even medical situations where you might want to get a quick burst of glucose into the bloodstream with one of those simple sugars. If I had a patient that was experiencing neurological symptoms and was about to pass out due to hypoglycemia, which is too low blood glucose levels, we're probably going to want to bring that up as quickly as possible with a simple sugar. If someone is running a marathon and this person is at mile 22 with depleted glycogen storage, and this person is anticipating a surge in pace to try to overtake their opponent during that last mile or two, they're likely going to be ingesting simple sugars throughout the race, because they certainly want to get that glucose into the bloodstream as soon as possible in order to be utilized by their muscles. Now, in part 2, we will talk about some athletes trying a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet and discuss how successful that strategy is, especially with high-intensity exercise. So stay tuned for that. But another example where ingesting simple sugars could be beneficial is if someone has more than one athletic event in a day, or maybe that person is training twice a day. After the first event or exercise session, that individual has likely depleted some, if not much, of their glycogen stores within their muscles. And so immediately after that session, they may want to ingest a simple carbohydrate to refill their glycogen stores as quickly as possible so that they can be ready to go for the second event or session later on in the day. Now granted, they'll probably also pair that with complex carbohydrates so they can more fully fill up their glycogen stores, and it does depend on the type of exercise that that person is performing. But the point is, there are situations where timing and how fast those carbohydrates can get absorbed is important, and so simple carbohydrates can be beneficial in certain situations. But again, this should not be the majority of one's carbohydrate intake. The majority should come from whole food, complex carbohydrate sources, and this leads us to the next set of drawbacks of simple sugars. Simple sugars are often referred to as empty calories, meaning all you get from them is calories. Whereas with many of the whole food, non-processed complex carbohydrate sources, you're getting other things like fiber, vitamins, and minerals. And because of those additional contents, such as fiber, in the complex carbohydrate sources, you often will feel fuller for a longer period of time, which leads us to our next drawback of simple sugars. We can eat a ton of simple sugars and not even feel that full. And overall as a society, we do eat a ton of them. And this is probably the biggest drawback or negative of sugar. Many of our foods have extra sugar added to them. And admittedly, we all mostly love how it tastes, but it adds additional unneeded calories. And it can potentially increase cravings toward sugar, which could cause one to ingest even more of it. And I'll often give my patients this example. If you were to go out to dinner with friends and family, and you stayed at the restaurant for an hour or so, and you refilled your beverage 3 times during that hour, if you were just drinking water, drinking those 3 glasses of water would add no extra calories to your meal, as opposed to having 3 refills of, say, my favorite soda, root beer. Yes, my soda of choice is the same choice that a child would make, but you can see how this could easily add extra calories to the overall meal. And you likely aren't going to feel any fuller. And that's not even accounting for any sugar that was potentially added to the food you were eating. And so here is the main problem with eating too many carbs, which again, most often comes from eating them in the form of too much sugar. You easily get into a caloric surplus and then can quickly start increasing body weight, mostly in the form of fat. And this is associated with so many of the health conditions that we see in our modern society, such as metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, potentially inflammatory conditions, and even certain cancers. But we need to make an important distinction here. This is an indirect result of carbohydrates, not this direct poisonous result. Your body is built to process and store a certain amount of carbs without any adverse health conditions. Now I know there may be some people that still push back on even that statement, but we'll address that soon. Often you will hear people say carbohydrates get stored as fat, but that is not initially true. The funny thing about this whole discussion is that fat that you eat gets stored as fat without any modifications. It's fat. But with carbohydrates, carbs only get stored as fat after you fill up what I like to refer to as your carbohydrate gas tanks. Your primary carbohydrate gas tanks include your liver and skeletal muscles. After you ingest carbohydrates, regardless if they're simple or complex, some of those carbohydrates will immediately get funneled into certain cells to be utilized for energy. But your liver has the ability to store extra carbohydrates as glycogen. You might remember me mentioning glycogen earlier on in the video, and glycogen is a polysaccharide that is the storage form of glucose. And your liver can store about 90 to 100 grams of glycogen. Your muscles can store even more, and they can store about 400 grams of glycogen, which makes a lot of sense because during certain forms of exercise, your muscles will primarily utilize carbohydrates, and having carbohydrates right within the muscle can easily break down the glycogen and use those individual glucose molecules to produce ATP. But after you completely fill up your glycogen stores in your liver and your skeletal muscles, then the excess carbohydrates will get converted to fat and then stored as adipose tissue, aka fatty tissue. And as you can imagine, if someone is eating carbohydrates in excess for an extended period of time, adipose tissue can continue to increase to the point where you start seeing those adverse health conditions. But again, this is a problem of excess, not carbs just being inherently bad, because many athletes can ingest a higher amount of carbohydrates, but not gain any excess fat, and therefore not have any negative health consequences, for 2 main reasons. 1, consistent exercise increases the glycogen storage capacity in your muscles. So a consistent exerciser can store even more carbs in their muscles before they start getting converted to fat. And all of those exercise and training sessions are constantly depleting their glycogen stores in their liver and skeletal muscles, and then they eat carbohydrates to refill them, but then they deplete them again, and then they refill them again, and overall, they never get to that point of eating them in excess, and therefore don't get converted to fat. But this brings us to the final question. How many carbs do you really need? And are there situations where you can live without eating any carbohydrates? So this is where we leave you with our teaser for part 2 of this video series, where we're going to talk about what influences how many carbohydrates you need, and we will find that does depend not only on your physical activity, but what type of exercise or physical activity you participate in. And again, if there are situations where you could not eat any carbs, which will obviously take us into ketosis and those ketogenic diets, and if athletes and exercisers can be successful on one of those types of diets. So stay tuned for part 2, but hopefully this was enough information for you to digest in this video. And I know this is one of those hotly debated topics, so please feel free to add some comments and questions below, as this could create some fun discussions and future video topics. Thanks for supporting the channel, everyone, and we'll see you in the next video.